Hello everybody and welcome back to another not applicable Formula 1 video. Let's talk testing. There have been cars, actual Formula 1 cars on a track for the first time since December, and oh my goodness me, I'm so excited about it. I need to get more Formula 1 in my life, and testing is just about enough to keep me going for now. I want to talk everything testing, go through what we've seen over the 3 days and talk about each day individually. I wanted to get out videos in between, but we are where we are. Let's talk day one then, and just some quick caveats on these. I've talked about the timings and tyres and laps for each driver over the course of these. So when it comes to tyres, all the compounds were available from Pirelli. So that's C5, which is the softest compound tyre, all the way to C1, which is the hardest compound tyre. And also the days were split into a morning and an afternoon session. I've just combined the morning and afternoons together to give a total day's worth of racing for each driver. So overall, what did we see? Well, to begin with, as you might be looking at these times, you're thinking, well, Lando Norris looks very, very good on day one, but also these cars look much, much slower than before. And that's kind of what we expected and kind of what we want, really, from Formula 1. The cars got to a point in the last era where they were so incredibly quick, but they couldn't do anything else. They couldn't really race each other overly much because they were so fast and designed to just be the quickest that they could possibly be. So we're not looking at, 116s like we might have been looking at in testing before. We're looking at 119s, 120s, and beyond that for this first day of testing. But overall, really impressive. Like, looking at the number of laps each team was able to do, each team really showed a lot of stability and a lot of impressive reliability over the first day. And I was really shocked by this. If you guys have been into Formula 1 since 2014, you'll know that back in 2014, the last time we had a massive overhaul of the regulations, the first day of testing was abysmal. There were cars dropping like flies. I think there was only about 90 laps completed in total in 2014. And we had lots of drivers getting over 90 laps or towards 90 laps all by themselves. So first of all, we saw that, and then we sort of saw lots of little things to do with aero that people were questioning. First of all, these cages that we saw on the cars, they are, again, an aero assist for the teams. They allow telemetry to go back to the teams straight away in terms of how the air is moving behind the car. So lots of people were questioning those, but don't worry, they are regular things that you will see on the Formula 1 cars, especially over these testing days. And also the paint as well. A similar sort of thing, just shows where the air is flowing over the wings, over the car. And also, I think makes the cars look pretty cool as well. So we saw lots of cages and lots of paint, but the big talking point in the first day of testing was Red Bull finally revealing what their car is going to look like in any kind of way. And it was really interesting to see where Red Bull have gone with their car this year. A really, really high nose considering, and similar to the Aston Martin in a way, in the way that it was sort of put together and looked. A very, very high nose, and the radiator inlet and side pot super undercut, similar to the Aston Martin. Completely different to what we're seeing from the likes of Mercedes and Ferrari. Whether or not they'll stick with it, whether it was something they brought for the testing, and whether the other teams have seen this now from Red Bull are like, wow, maybe we've made a mistake, because Adrian Newey usually knows what he's talking about. So that was sort of the main talking points from the first day of testing. The cars were back on track. They were actually working. We saw the cages, saw the paint, and saw Red Bull's car finally coming to fruition. But the first day mainly was the drivers, getting used to the new cars, understanding the new aerodynamics, and getting a feel for what it's going to be like in those cars during a race as well. And also, while we're on it, the DRS looked really weird on these new cars. I don't know whether it's just me, but it properly looks letterboxy on these new cars. And I know that DRS is sort of here to stay for the meantime. Hopefully these cars will be able to follow a little bit closer and we won't need it too much. But whether the DRS will stay long term, we don't know. At the moment, it looks a bit weird on these cars. We moved then into day two, and Ferrari looking really quick again. Like, they were right up there on day one and topping the timings on day two as well, and on a slightly harder compound tyre than Pierre Gasly and Daniel Ricciardo behind. We had George Russell up there, Carlos Sainz also up there too, and Lewis Hamilton finally stepped into the fray, but only on the C2 tyres. So again, we're sort of starting to pick up a little bit of information. There's not too much we can take from the timings overall, though. Mainly the fact that Haas and Alfa Romeo are the cars that are really struggling over this weekend. Like, we thought they might have teething problems on day one, but that sort of persisted into day two as well, especially Valtteri Bottas really, really struggling at this point to get any kind of times on the board. And Sergio Perez was actually the car to bring out the first red flag of the week. And as I said, day one looked really impressive. All of the cars, great reliability. And then Sergio Perez brings out a red flag, stops the track. Seems like a gearbox issue that they might have had, but they were very quick to cover up the Red Bull car and take it back into the garage and try and hide away whatever was going on under the bonnet that might have gone wrong. But the big talking point from the second day was this porpoising that we saw, not from the likes of Mercedes, but more so from the likes of Ferrari, and this bouncing up and down at really high speeds. And I think what it was a lot of the teams are trying to get used to this ground effect that is now coming into fruition, and especially when they're following behind cars and traveling at really, really high speeds that they maybe, haven't seen properly in the wind tunnel testing, the car started to bounce up and down. You could see the suspension like gearing in and gearing out and properly fluctuating the move of the car. But apparently that is actually okay. That is fine. Binotto came out and was talking about the Ferrari because it was Charles Leclerc that was really bouncing up and down on that second day, and said it's quite a straightforward fix for the teams to put forward, but actually optimizing performance while fixing the car and making sure that porpoising doesn't happen is another game. And we've seen the Mercedes wasn't really porpoising too much, so maybe they found something that other teams haven't to this point, but lots of other teams really bouncing up and down on that suspension and struggling a little bit with the learning curve of the ground effect cars. The second thing we also saw on day two was cars following each other, and now this is the really big talking point for this new iteration of cars. This was what Ross Brawn brought to the table, where people are like, okay, we really want to see this over the course of Formula One. The cars actually getting closer to one another. Because as I said, last year's cars and the cars of this sort of previous generation were really, really quick, but they weren't able to actually race each other. And Formula One at the end of the day is a racing competition. We want to see these cars going wheel to wheel. And Carlos Sainz was following behind Max Verstappen for a chunk of the session. And then we also saw Max Verstappen following behind Fernando Alonso for the chunk of the session as well. But the main thing that we sort of saw was these cars attempting to follow behind, and it actually going quite well for them. Carlos Sainz said there are already differences between last year's car and this year's car in terms of their ability to follow behind, and he said that he's positive about the changes that have happened to the car. And Max Verstappen sort of reiterated this, said he found following a little bit easier. There was less understeer and oversteer when you were following in the dirty air of cars in front. And that's what we want to see. And it's good that that's come into fruition even in these early stages of practice. And it's good that these cars are trusting themselves to really follow behind another driver and understand how that's going to affect their balance and their drive behind when they are racing wheel to wheel like we want to see. And obviously this is the biggest thing that Formula One fans are looking forward to. Hopefully this sort of kicks in the gear of, okay, these cars can get really, really close to each other. How close are they going to be able to push in those corners? And when it comes to that first race, how close are they really going to be able to be with the DRS as well? There's lots of different dynamics yet to come, and obviously we're very early in this testing too. That led on to the final day of testing. 3 days of testing that we saw, and a little bit of a split more so with this day. There was dry testing in the morning, but then they actually put in an artificial wet test in the afternoon, which we'll talk about, which was for Pirelli basically to see whether the intermediate and wet tyres would also hold up over the course of a race and how they would change over the course of the race too. But now, as you can see, when it came to day 3, the big teams really did step up. It was Hamilton and Russell at the top on the softest compound of tyre, we do have to say, the C5, that, really stepped up a gear. And then Max Verstappen, Sergio Perez just behind as well in the Red Bull. So those two big teams from last year seem like they might be the two big teams again. Ferrari dropping down a little bit compared to where they were in days 1 and day 2. And similar for McLaren as well, dropping down to 10th and 11th. Whereas, Norris and Ricciardo had really been pushing those top 1, top 2, top 3 spots over the first couple of days. But also we started to see those reliability issues. The red flag finally came out on a fairly consistent basis, especially in the morning. Whether or not that was teams, trying out new things that they hadn't quite tried out before over the course of the first 2 testing days and maybe reshuffling some things, especially the Alpine, that seems to be the case. Alpine was the first car to bring out the red flag. It was Fernando Alonso that unfortunately had a low pressure engine issue by the sounds of things, and he was saying that the car was probably the best it had been for the 3 days that morning. They changed a few of the aero things towards the back of the car, and apparently it just really clicked for Fernando Alonso, and Alpine were looking really, really quick. And then they had that issue. So maybe something to go back to the drawing board with, but some information and some really key information that Alpine will take forward, I'm sure. We then also saw Gasly in the alphatauri. He was in the wall. That seemed to be more of a driver error than a car error, but also meant that they weren't able to take part in the in the afternoon session. Then we obviously had Zhou as well went off the track a little bit towards the end of the session. Vettel had an oil leak in the Aston Martin, and of course issues for Haas as well over the course of the weekend. And now I'll address the elephant in the room. It's not my place to really say. Obviously, Haas are going through lots of turmoil, it seems, on and off the track. They hadn't had a good week of testing, and obviously that was interrupted by what had happened in Russia and Ukraine. Again, as I said, I'm no expert on this. I'm not going to try and put my ideas forward of what's happened. I just hope everybody is staying as safe as they possibly can, and I hope, if it is affecting you, you can try and find some solace somewhere and look after yourself, basically. And I'm really hoping it doesn't affect Haas too much. I know they obviously ran the white livery on the final day of testing. They took all of their Uralkali logos off of everything, and I think they did the right thing there. Obviously, Formula One has also come out and said they won't be taking part in the Russian Grand Prix if things stay the same. Lots of sports have come out and talked about it, but it's not my place to say. I don't really know what's going on. I'm not that heavily educated on world politics, but as I said, keep yourself safe. And in terms of Haas, I hope that the Haas team have been able to get through this and it won't affect the Haas team going forward. I love that they're still on the grid. I thought that we might see the end of them last year, and the fact that they've really come into 2022 and it looks like they could have a really good car. They've had a few reliability issues, but they could take steps forward over the course of the next few testing sessions and really push themselves a little bit further. But as I said, let's move on and talk about Formula One a little bit more. The afternoon session was a wet race session. So Pirelli were trying to look at, the aerodynamics of the cars, how they would, the stability of the cars in the wet weather conditions, the intermediate and wet compound tyres, how they would do. And only 6 cars were able to take part after all the issues that happened in the morning and the red flags that happened in the morning. But lots of learning to take away, especially, I think, for the teams that stayed out there until the intermediates turned back into slicks. I think that's a really crucial piece of information, and something that we maybe don't talk about a lot is that turning point between intermediate and slick tyres. Like, when can you change to the slick tyres in a race? And those teams are going to have gained some really good knowledge about that over the course of that afternoon session, and hopefully that's something we see come to fruition with those cars over the course of the season, and those cars in testing that were able to do that, maybe we'll know when to change to the slick tyres a little bit earlier than those cars around them. Overall then, for the weekend, here's some totals for you. We had the drivers and total laps. Oh, and I've just realised that Bottas has dropped off the bottom of that image. Apologies, Bottas. It really wasn't the weekend for you. In 20th place, hardly any laps completed by the Finn. And then Mazepin, Schumacher just above in the Haas. As I said, they had issues on and off the track. Zhou, though, was the only Alfa Romeo driver that was able to really get some laps into that car. Tsunoda there, Stroll, Ocon and Alonso, Latifi completing over 100 laps apiece between them. And then above 150, we've got Perez, Norris, Vettel, Hamilton, Gasly, and then even cars into the 200s with Leclerc, Verstappen, Albon, Russell, Ricciardo, and Carlos Sainz completing the most laps of anyone over the 3 days. And that kind of led to the similar sort of thing with the constructors. Haas having the worst weekend in terms of the overall team, but Alfa Romeo having a big jump between their 2 drivers. Alpine slotting in 8th place, Aston Martin 7th, AlphaTauri 26th. Williams having a really good week with 5th place in terms of laps completed. Red Bull, McLaren, Mercedes and Ferrari, the top 4 teams there. And the big 4 from last season seem to be the teams that are getting it right again this season. In terms of my overall thoughts from testing, I think, when it comes to Alfa Romeo and Haas, is struggling for consistency between those two teams at the moment, and hopefully, especially Bottas even said he hopes he can make up for some lost time over the course of this week, but it was a real struggle for him in his Alfa Romeo sort of swan song that he is going into. And then Williams had a great showing, very pleased for them, hope they can continue on that good form and maybe even show a little bit more pace. Albon had a really good day too, so let's see what happens with the Williams team. Maybe they can push up into those midfield battles. Talking about that midfield, the alphatauris, Aston Martins and Alpines from last year, they had 50-50 battles between them, a few little niggles here and there, and obviously the Aston Martin, AlphaTauri and Alpine all causing a red flag on the final day. Probably wasn't something that they wanted to happen. And then it's that big 4, isn't it? Perez, came out and said that the Red Bull looked great and that they had a really lovely baseline to work from. Obviously, the aerodynamics of the Red Bull looking completely different to anything else out there. Ricciardo and Norris were both feeling really positive, especially Norris after the first day, topping those timing sheets. Ricciardo seems a little bit more confident in the car that he's in this year compared to last year. And then, of course, we had Hamilton downplaying Mercedes a little bit, saying that they had obstacles to overcome. And George Russell actually talked really elegantly on the second day, talking about his running and how, the Red Bulls, the Ferraris, the McLarens, they're going to be there. It's going to be a battle over the course of the season, but he's looking forward to that transition to Mercedes, and he thinks that he has the ability to win races, get pole positions. And he's saying all the right things for me, where George Russell is, maybe going to be a bit more comfortable in that Mercedes coming into the first race of the season, and is maybe someone to watch. And then at the top of the tree, Ferrari, with 439 laps between them, did more laps than anybody else by a considerable margin, and they look really good. All eyes were on Ferrari. I know people keep hyping up Ferrari for this season, but they're starting to make it look like it might happen, because that was a very good showing from Ferrari, in my opinion. And we'll have to wait and see for the second lot of testing, but I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments down below. What did you think about testing? What were the key takeaways from you over the course of the testing? And also, from this, can we actually guess, or start to guess, the constructors and drivers that might be at the top of the tree next year? I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments down below. Thank you so much for watching. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video. Subscribe if you are new to the channel. I also have to say thank you to CF Racing for giving me lots of these statistics over the course of the racing days that we've just seen. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.